What do you get in income statement? Well, income statement, as the name suggests, is some sort of measure of income. So income statement measures revenues and expenses, and we define them in a very specific way in accordance with the rules of GAAP, which is short for Generally Accepted Accounting Principles. And it lists them in a certain way so that we can interpret different things. Any other financial statement you know of? What does balance sheet do?
Records the assets and the liabilities and stuff.
Yeah, it lists things you own and things you owe. Things we own have a fancy name, it's called assets, and things we owe have a fancy name, it's called liabilities. And balance sheet also lists the difference between them, known as equity. You may hear it as shareholders' equity, total equity, owner's equity, but it's all the same thing. From a personal viewpoint, stuff I own, stuff I owe, and my net worth, which is the difference between the two. But there is a certain way I value things in a balance sheet, especially assets. Assets, for example, are recorded at historical cost minus any depreciation there may be. So if I buy a car for $25,000 and IRS allows me to write off 30% of this depreciation next year, I'm going to list that at $17,500 because I wrote off $7,500 as depreciation. The year after that, maybe another 20%, so it's going to be $12,500. The value listed in the financial in balance sheet may or may not be the same as the actual value. We make a distinction between book value of things, the value that we record in financial statements, and market value of things, the value at which I can sell it. For example, you bought a car for $25,000. 1 month later, you're not going to be able to write off much depreciation legally. But if you try to sell it in the used car market, it's going to be a lot lower. 2 years ago, that wasn't the case. Because of supply chain issues, there was actually a premium to used cars. I was going to trade in my, I had an old car. It was a big car that I didn't want it too much. It was a 2018 Chevy Traverse. It had 97,000 miles on it. I mean, when new, those cars are about 50 grand. And I was able to trade that in for, I think, 6,000 or so. And I bought a brand new Subaru Forester. Not a lot of bells and whistles on it. For what? 27.5 or something like that. I said, I usually buy a car when I'm buying a new car. I buy something that has 5,000 to 10,000 miles on it. I asked for one of those. She said, you would actually pay more for that car than for the new car, as long as you're willing to wait for the new car. I was. They basically ordered it for me. 3 months later, it came from Japan. Sometimes, the market value could even be bigger than the book value in that case. So there is no necessary relationship between the two. This is especially true for things like real estate. Real estate doesn't depreciate that fast. In fact, land doesn't depreciate at all. Suppose you bought a piece of land around New Circle 30 years ago. If you know anything about Lexington, 30 years ago, anything outside New Circle was a horse farm, okay? Or it was just land. Now that land is quite valuable. So the book value and the market value have nothing to do with each other. There are certain assets They're not even listed as assets. Anytime accountants attach a value of 0 to something, it's not listed. Who does not know about Steve Jobs here? I know he died a while ago, but you guys do know about him, right? He's the reason Apple is Apple today. They actually fired him back in 1995, if I'm not mistaken. Within 2 years, Apple was at the brink of bankruptcy. And by, I think, 99 or 2000, they hired him back. And immediately he came up with iPod and the Apple Music Store, iTunes. And you all know about iPhone and other stuff. When it was announced that Steve Jobs had terminal pancreatic cancer, Apple stock tanked, I think, close to 10% that day. That's basically the value market attaches to Steve Jobs as an asset to Apple. But if you look at the financial statements of Apple, you're not going to see an item called Steve Jobs unless they actually bought him. Okay? You have that with sports companies. You can buy a player from somebody else and you pay money, right? Accountants put on a value and they have a consistent way of valuing them. When I purchase an asset, I know how much I pay, so I'm gonna book it like that. But if it's an asset like Steve Jobs, nobody's gonna argue that Steve Jobs was not an asset to Apple. But as far as the accountants are concerned, that was worth precisely 0. In many cases, there's a big difference between the book value of assets and the market value, especially for tech companies. And there are certain things, there is no value attached to brand name Coca-Cola, right? I mean, who's going to argue here that Coca-Cola is not a valuable brand name? In fact, any brand name. You guys know about OEM manufacturing? For example, let's say you're going to buy Excedrin. Okay? I use a lot Tums, for example. If I buy the actual Tums, it's a certain amount of value, but there's an identical product that is sold as CVS or Walgreens. They actually go to the company that makes Tums. They make it for them, but they don't put the name Tums on it. The difference between the two is the value of the brand. Because, Walgreens didn't spend any money advertising on all this stuff. But unless you actually purchase that brand, you're not going to see any value attached to that brand. Now, there is a certain way let me make this a bit bigger. There's a certain order in which we list things on the balance sheet, both for assets and liabilities. That's because our purpose with financial statement is to tell stories. Yeah. I mean, they don't have to be stories like The Old Man and the Sea. Who knows the last line of the Old Man and the Sea? I'm sorry, who knows who wrote Old Man and the Sea? I mean, I probably went to school with him, but, Papa, Ernest Hemingway. It's one of his short stories, probably the most beautiful one. The last line is, nada y nada y nada y nada y nada. Nothing and nothing and nothing and nothing. This is an old guy who's a fisherman. He pretty much dies while fishing. Anyway. So there's a story, but just like any story, the audience matters. You tell different stories to different audiences. So in finance case, our audience are different kinds of stakeholders. You tell stories for shareholders, you tell stories for debt holders, people who lend you money, or people who are to receive money from you. You have stories to tell to regulators, stories to tell to, your workers and what have you. That's why we have a kind of a certain way we list things. Who knows how we list assets on balance sheet? In what order? There's a certain order to it. What is the order in which we list the assets on a balance sheet? If you know.
Cash first.
Hmm?
Cash first.
Cash first, but that's the
Most liquid to
most liquid to least liquid. Who's gonna give me a definition of liquidity?
It's what you, like what cash you can actually get out of an asset.
No, that's not, that's market value in a sense.
its ability to hold its value over time.
No.
Isn't how fast you can something like that?
Almost. But with the proviso that I can turn anything into cash very fast. If I want to sell an Airbus 330, all I have to do is list it 50% below market value. On eBay, I'm going to sell it in 5 seconds. Okay? But if I actually want to sell it at market value, the damn thing costs what, $200-300 million? It's not going to be that easy to sell it at that value. But if you have 2 oranges, you can convert that to cash pretty quickly. If you have 10 shares of Google